Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark and you are listening to The Reese Show. On this show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review, you can tell your friends, you can name your first child Reese, whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Hello, listeners. Today I'm excited to chat with Tamim Ansary. Tamim is an Afghanistan-American author and public speaker. He's the author of the excellent books Destiny Disrupted and Games Without Rules. Thanks, Tamim, for being on the show, and welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And we're here in person, which is fun. Tamim I biked up the hill, one of the various hills in San Francisco, and he has given me tea, and I am happy about that. And so I'm sweaty, but happy to be here.
I should have given you iced tea. I have some iced tea, actually.
But maybe after the show, maybe after. So today, Tamim and I are going to chat about, he's Afghan-American, and he wrote this beautiful, amazing book, Destiny Disrupted. I just went to Egypt, and so I was like, wow, I don't understand the Middle East at all. And so I was trying to find out, how can I understand the Middle East, and how can I understand Islam? And I just feel, grateful to have found your book because it was such an amazing dive into that. So we're going to chat about that side of things, and we're also going to chat about the kind of Afghanistan side of things and how that connects to the modern day. Okay. So let's start with the Destiny Disrupted side, and your kind of the world history of these two parallel worlds, the Western world and then the kind of Middle Eastern or middle world narrative. Could you say a little bit more about the thesis of that book and what that, Islamic narrative looks like?
Okay, well, the thesis of the book, let's step back a little bit from the Islamic narrative per se, and just go back to the launching idea that got me into writing that book, which was we have been accustomed to thinking of the history of the world as if it is a natural fact. Mm-hmm. It is some collection of facts about events, and the only thing we have to do is to simplify it, get away, clear away the unimportant details, and then the important details that remain will be a certain edifice. But actually, my perception is, my premise is that every history of the world is actually the story of how we got to here. Mm-hmm. And so embedded in that narrative, there's always an assumption about who the we is at the center of the story. And then also, where is the here? So, it was obviously after 9/11, there was a certain spur to just thinking about Islam and Islamic history. Mm-hmm. And I had been invited to enlighten my friends and
people like me who were like, I just went to Egypt for a bit,
Well, especially after 9/11, now people have forgotten that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, most people in the West hardly even knew that the Islamic world existed in a sense, Mm-hmm. And I was a textbook editor for a portion of my life, and one of the things I worked on was world history textbooks for high school. That's, I think 10th or 11th grade, that's when they do world history, and I worked on several of those. And one of the things that stood out was that Islamic history and Islam in general as a phenomenon in history was something that was covered in one section of 30 chapters in a book. And
chapter 18, you get, here was the caliphate or whatever,
Right. So then after 9/11, actually I was on the plane going back to the east where I hadn't been for a long time. I was headed to Pakistan at that point. And I was reading some books about Islamic history. And it struck me that, there's a curious parallelism between the history that's familiar to us as the shape of world history that I was editing textbooks about, And this other history that I was also actually very familiar with, because I grew up in Afghanistan, and that's the history I learned in school. And what struck me was, when you look back into the past from the Western perspective, Rome looms large as the empire of the world at one point. And the the legacy can be seen so close to the modern day because the ruler of Rome came to be known as Caesar because of Julius Caesar. And in fact, the last time there was a Caesar was the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany. That was still that same title. And Rome eroded because the barbarians came down from the north. Now you look over at the Islamic world, and it's like, hey, you look back and there is a very similar in scope and importance empire back there, which was the Caliphate, and at a certain period, it bloomed, it expanded, it was the empire of the world, and then it sort of eroded and crumbled. Why? The barbarians came down from the north. But the title that was the title of the ruler of the Caliphate, which is the Khalifa, that title persisted all the way to when? World War I. The last Khalifa was the last person to take that title was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And right at that time, incidentally, there was a certain move in the Muslim world to name the king of Afghanistan as the new Khalifa. As it happens, the king of Afghanistan at that point was the most opposite of a Khalifa kind of guy that you could pick, because he was the archetypal modernist who became one of the figures that in the flow of Islamic history said, let's have done with those old ideas about religion. Let's get with the modern world. So he wasn't a good candidate for Khalifa, and there was never after that a Khalifa. But the parallelism of those two histories made me think, oh, wait a minute, the history of the Islamic world, if you're there from the point of view of the Muslims, it's not the history of the Islamic world, it's the history of the world. And then it struck me that there's lots of histories of the world. Every history of the world is a somebody-centric narrative about how we got to where we are today, which is what gave me the impetus for the last book I published, The Invention of Yesterday, which was prompted by the observation that we are all connected now. It's like it's one. There is one humanity, and at that time I said, and we're verging on merging into a single civilization. Shouldn't there be an attempt now to look back and construct a world history that answers to the question, how did we get to here where we are today? So that's what I tried to do with The Invention of Yesterday, tell that story. And that's my larger preoccupation these days.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I think that it is so true that once you start to read, I think that you're correct to say that history is not some kind of here was the facts. This happened. This, and it's no, it's a narrative. How did we get to here? I just think that's a great encapsulation of it. Who is we? Who is here? And I think that the parallelisms are so strong. I think something in your book that you did a really good job of is you said, hey, the kind of Western world or the Mediterranean world was based around the sea routes. So you have Rome and all these sea routes, and then on the middle world, or what we in America call the Middle East, is it's based around these land routes. Through Turkey and Iran and Persia and those kinds of things. And so I think that just thinking of those as okay, you have these two kind of big empires that were happening around these different things, and then eventually once the sea travel that the Western Europeans had been doing for so long could actually allow them to explore the rest of the world, then that was one of the many reasons why they were able to kind of win after the Industrial Revolution.
That's
and
right,
information and stuff.
That's one of the reasons.
Exactly. So, Ergo, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, first of all, there's other ones of those big routes too.
What are those? Yeah.
Well, there's the Monsoon route. There's from the east coast of Africa around India and over to China, there's the interesting phenomenon of the monsoons, which are these winds that blow out of the heart of the world's biggest continent, which is Asia. And because of the Himalaya mountains, they get split, and one set of them goes out across China and into the Pacific, and one set of them goes down across the Indian Ocean. And so they, because of the fluctuation of temperature at the heart of Asia, they blow out, and then half the year they blow in. And so from China and from the east coast of Africa, going back forever, whoever put a boat in, there was a certain season in which they could
go out.
They could go out and they could get where would they get to? They'd get to what we call Southeast Asia. They get to Malaysia and all those islands.
Yeah.
And then they'd have to wait until the winds changed, and the winds would bring them back. So then you have this whole sort of Southeast Asian world, which is a cultural mix and stew of the influences from China on the one side and from Arabia and the African coast on the other side, and India.
Yeah. So there's the monsoon world, and then the other world that comes to mind, there's kind of, to some extent, there's like the Indian subcontinent world, which has like both the Indus River Valley civilization at the beginning, and then later a lot of the like kind of Muslim world kind of comes into it.
Right.
There's also the kind of Chinese empire world, and that's one that I don't really understand well. But how do you think about that world, how that world defines it's how we got to here?
Well, it's interesting to note that like around the time I was writing I was starting to write Invention of Yesterday. Yeah. This conversation came up, and somehow the word China was mentioned, and someone in our group that was discussing said, "Oh yeah, the periphery." Well, now the periphery.
Oh my God.
Wait, China is not the periphery. My God, most of the people on Earth live in China or India.
That's hilarious.
How could that be the periphery? But So China was one of those places that at one point in ancient times, those rivers in China, chiefly, the Huanghe, the Yellow River, was one of those places where human beings could find the resources they needed to build a enduring and prosperous life if they could get together, so to speak. So that was one of the spots where culture and civilization, was born and then began to grow from there. And my one of the points I make, I don't know if I should go so far as to call it my thesis, but it's just one of the observations that came across my desk as I was looking at this stuff. Well, it has to do with geography. It's like there were 4 rivers. Probably more, but let's take the 4 that are standard, places where cradles of civilization. Okay, so there was China, there was India with the Indus River, there was the Mesopotamian, and there was Nile. These rivers all had one property that was similar. They flooded annually, and then you could grow stuff in the rich soil that the floods left behind. But they were actually very different from each other in other ways. And the geography of the river had something to do with the original impetus or the character that the civilization took when it emerged along those riverbanks. So the one in China, unlike those others, what it was it flooded unpredictably and catastrophically from time to time. The Yellow River was this silt that came down, and then the riverbed rose, so the river rose, so people would put dikes along the river in order to be able to continue to just survive there. And then once in a while there'd be a flood and the dikes would break. So that catastrophe at the core was something that the culture had to absorb and build around. But as it developed, China, early Chinese historians have this narrative of China which looks at the world as concentric. It's like China, the empire is the center of the world, and around the empire is the tributaries. And then around the tributaries are the barbarians. And then around the barbarians are who cares? Far away. So that was kind of like the model of the world that people lived inside of. And the sense of reality was the empire was not, strictly speaking, a secular thing. The empire was I'm just making up a way to describe it, but it's like a funnel from some imponderable, universal, cosmic, supernatural realm, order could come into the world. And there was a pulse to the empire. It would come together, there would be order, and then it would break apart, and there would be fragmentation. There would be a single empire, and then there would be dueling empires. When there was dueling empires, or when the empire was falling apart, the barbarians began to come in. Not because the barbarians were so great, but because something was going wrong within the heart of the world. Now, the interesting thing is, all of these ancient narratives, to me, they have something really powerful in them. There is something about that, about order coalescing and then breaking apart and coming. China is not the only place that has this idea of the world is concentric and we're at the center of it, and then there's the tributaries and then there's the barbarians. So
that's interesting. I feel like thinking about the Monsoon world is as one kind of self-contained world, and then the Chinese one is kind of, and I guess that for me is a it's just like more reading to be done in the future, But going back to like both the middle world and the like kind of Islamic world, I think that there's one interesting part of it, and I guess just to get your take on it here is. There's this progression of Muhammad, and then there is the first caliphate, and then the Rashidun. I'm going to say all the names wrong, but Rashidun, and then let me try to get all mine, Umayyad, and then the Abbasid, and then after that kind of like the Ottoman one after the Mongols had done the barbarian thing. And then there's post the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. There's also the rise of the West, and then the kind of battle between West and modernity versus kind of this older and also more Islamic kind of thing. And I think something that you piece at in your book, which is really interesting, is this battle today between the West and the kind of modernity, and you said it beautifully, where it's like when for after 9/11, the folks we thought that we being Americans, we thought that the Islamic folks were angry at us because of our freedom. And so we said back to them, no, we are free. And they were like, whoa, we don't care about your freedom. Freedom's fine. It's about decadence. They point at us and they say, no, you're decadent. You're too decadent and like materialist and those things. So how do you think about the modern battle between those two things and decadence versus freedom, and how kind of religion plays a role in that?
Well, now we've come back a little bit to, I didn't read the book about weird, but I know the thesis and I read your review of it. And so that comes into this whole question here. There is an impulse in modernity, in what we're calling modernity. That already is a loaded term, if you take my point. There might be other ways to get to modernity than this way, but this way is one that is very wrapped up in faith versus reason, science versus religion, all that stuff that happened in Europe during the time that we're calling the Renaissance Enlightenment, and at that time, the couple of things that really gained momentum in the West was individualism and secular view of the world. But over and above all those, as you haven't read The Invention of Yesterday, so I'm gonna
spoil it. It's all good, spoil it, and I'm excited to dive more into it in a second.
Okay, so I think there's a really fundamental narrative that became the narrative of the West, and I call it the progress narrative. And the progress narrative, I would characterize it as the view that the the project of civilization, the project of human life is to make progress. Every day more than the last day. Every day can be better. And that the through line of history is sometimes things happen and there's regress, and then you collect yourself and you continue to make progress. And there's no end to it. It's just, it can go forever. And you can see how that fits right in with capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, because capitalism, the core underlying impulse there is that more is better. And in the East, at the time that the progress narrative was being born in the West, the archetypal type of narrative that was putting down roots in the East was what I call the Restoration narrative. And the way I see it, there was this Holocausty sort of period when the last of the great nomad explosions, the explosion of Genghis Khan, and all that accompanied that, and then at the same, like right on the heels of that, the plague, which swept across. So, as the recovery happened from that period of disorder and Holocaust, the Islamic world and the Chinese world had a very recent glorious past to look back on, and said, "Oh, we got to get back to that." But in the West, the very recent past before the Black Death was peasants. Most everybody was peasants, and everybody was poor. And so now, in the wake of in the aftermath of the Black Death, it really was true that every day could be better than the last, and there was a glamour to innovation. For the Islamic world, now I'm going to just zero in on Islam, there is something at the very heart of Islam, which is the notion at the heart of it is a community. The mystical event in Islam is the birth of that community and the way that it was successful. Its success was the mark of its trueness. You see,
the ummah,
ummah, and it's exemplified or symbolized by the fact that Islamic history marked year one not as the year that Muhammad was born, not as the year that Muhammad died, not even as the year that Muhammad had the revelation that turned him from an ordinary human into the prophet, the messenger of God. No, year one was the year that the Muslims left Mecca and went to Medina, because that's the period in which they were able to begin actually and practically trying out this idea about the community. Would it work? Could the community really operate the way that Muhammad was preaching that it should, that God said it should? And it's amazing, prosperity in the immediate after that. Within 100 years, it was the biggest political entity that had ever existed up until that point. So that was completely remarkable. Anybody who was living in that event, it's no surprise that they would think, this is something. This is something supernatural happening. I'm part of that. So, when the time came that a reviving Muslim world, which was built on the restoration narrative, we were right. Let's get back to what we were doing. That was the truth. When they discovered that in their own societies, there were these people that had come and said, "Hey, could we trade a few things for a few things of yours?" And now suddenly they were everywhere, and you had to go to them to get a license if you wanted to do business. What was that all about? So that's the thing that was, from the Muslim point of view, that was that was the event of the age. The struggle with this other. It's not just a struggle with some conquering people, because they didn't, for the most part, come with armies. It wasn't the war. It was a struggle with some other idea that for some strange reason was winning. And it was like it couldn't win. How could that idea win? There must be something that we're doing wrong or something. Whereas, you can easily see why from the Western point of view, it was hardly noticeable that they were having a struggle. It's like, I don't think the Western Europeans that came to the Islamic world spent very much time at all saying, now this idea seems stronger than ours, why? Or our idea is better than this idea. This idea just didn't even exist. This was what the natives thought. Of course they were wrong. Look at who's in whose country.
Exactly. We're here. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a fun. I mean, I like the idea of the progress versus kind of Reformation narratives, and I think the progress one I just super agree with. So I'm currently writing this book called What Information Wants, and it's about genes and memes and how there are these ideas that spread through society, and that some of those ideas, all these ideas need attention, and they need capital, and they need progress, and if they don't, then they die. And so with religions, we can see it very clearly with stuff like jihad turning from struggle into an active let's actually go conquer other places. And with Christianity, you can see it through having lots of kids, or through with Catholicism, or through missionary work, or those kind of things. But I think you're super correct into saying that capitalism, as a similar kind of ideology, it has this progress narrative or this development narrative, which it still wants to fuel itself. And in order to do that, it needs to, quote unquote, what it sees as make progress, aka make development happen, aka industrialize all the things, Is that kind of in alignment with how you see that progress narrative?
It is. And the progress narrative was so successful that in the Islamic world, and pretty much throughout what used to be called the developing world, that's an obsolete term in a lot of ways now, but throughout the world that was lagging behind, people would argue with the social mores of the West, but they wanted the industry. They wanted the cars. And it struck me so forcefully. The first time I went back to Afghanistan after 38 years, which was in 2001, right after 9/11. And that city was clamorous with cars. It was polluted. It was full of... And there was hurry and bustle, and it had been ruined, reduced to rubble in the wars, but still it was just clamorous. And I remembered the city I left, and I remembered that it was so quiet there, and it was so private, and everything that was worth anything was happening inside the private world. And it struck me that nobody in that world would have traded the world they were living in for this world. But nobody ever had that choice. What they did have a choice of in that world was, do you want a car? Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I want this world with a car.
Exactly. And then before long, everybody, game theoretically, everybody accidentally got a car. Oh, now the world kind of sucks,
right. And now there's a traffic jam and I can't get out of it.
Exactly. I was reminded of that in when I was in Cairo recently, and it was I kind of talk about Cairo as a city with 20 million people in one park. It's kind of just
one what?
One park. It's tons and tons of people, all these big towers. It's just you can, and there's one park that you can go to, and you have to pay to get in. And so it's just oh boy. And it wasn't that was the choice of anybody, but that's just what happens to these big cities. So let's kind of zoom in on Afghanistan for a second. And I guess we have this kind of big macro narrative of the kind of Islamic story versus the Western kind of Roman story, and then Afghanistan is a part of that, as a sub part of that. Tell me, I guess, I really loved your term of games without rules. Kind of tell me a little bit more about, I guess maybe the easiest way to do this is to say, what is the short history of Afghanistan, and how does games without rules kind of play into that history?
Well, the part of Afghan history that I really focused in on was the part that began around the same time that the United States was born. Because Afghanistan was born as a country right around that same time.
What was the first guy's name again?
Ahmad Shah Baba.
There's him, and then there's also, I thought there was a guy in 1830 or something.
Well, there was Dus Mohammad.
Mohammad is, I think.
Dus Mohammad Khan. Well, these are all big characters. That's true. The Afghan history is full of really, each of them could be a movie.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So sorry to interrupt, but yes, it starts there.
Right. So, before that, there's often been something in Afghanistan. It is just as much a distinct place in which some sort of imperial form or state form constantly takes shape, as is, let's say, Iran. There's always been some kind of Iranian empire. By always, I don't mean since the Big Bang. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
But there's always been something there. So Afghanistan is one of those, and where it is it's between India, Iran, where the Turks lived, and over there China. So it's where people went through to get to other places. And there's something about Afghanistan that is quintessentially that. I say in Games Without Rule, but I'm going to repeat it, quote myself. Yeah. This idea that Afghanistan can't be conquered is total nonsense. Afghanistan has been conquered again and again. And the people who conquered it are called Afghans now. Mm-hmm. They're all from someplace else. Even the Pashtuns, who are often considered, those are the real Afghans. No, until recent times, you know who they thought they were? They thought they were the lost tribes of Israel. Mm. They thought they were the two that got lost, or one of those. They claimed they came from someplace else. And but in the period that I'm talking about, that's when the modern state started to form. Yeah. And that modern state started to form exactly when this other drama we're talking about, Western civilization coming into the Islamic world, and the confrontation between two ideas, one of which was overwhelmingly more powerful than the other. That's exactly when the state formation of Afghanistan began. Mm-hmm. And Afghanistan is like an example of a process that I described in Destiny Disrupted, which is that in the attempt to figure out why are we not succeeding, we Muslims, against this ideology that is not Islam. Mm-hmm. If we're going to reject the idea that Islam actually turns out to have been false, which is an idea which I think did not enter the head of any Afghan. Yeah. No Afghan thought that. And I think generally throughout the Islamic world, that's not one of the things people thought. So the three things the three, there's probably many different things people thought, but in general, three of the directions that people took in groping and grappling with this conundrum. One was, we've been too literal about our religion. We've been too, wrapped up in the outward forms of religion, and we should rethink our religion as a system of ethics and morals and fundamental rules. And this will allow us, to become secular, so that people would look at people like my father, for example. He would look at the scriptures and say, he told me this exactly. He said, Bachim, my boy, Islam is fundamentally, you be a good neighbor, you be a good human, you be a good friend, you don't lie, you don't cheat. If you do those things, that's what it means to be a good Muslim. Mm-hmm. I like to call my father that kind of fundamentalist. Yeah. So that's a kind of fundamentalist. Yeah. And but like many people, it's like many scholars in the Muslim world who are modernist in that way, look to the various, to the Quran, to the Hadith, and then to the other scriptural sort of commentaries, and they looked for ways in which the modern values of Western civilization are not contradicting what was said in the Quran. So my father would say, it says you can have up to 4 wives if you can treat them exactly equally. Mm-hmm. My son, it's impossible for any man to treat 4 different women exactly equally. He's right about that. Yeah, actually. And my father, who enjoyed a glass of wine in his day, or even perhaps a a shot of whiskey. He said, look, here in the Quran it says, don't go to your prayers if you're intoxicated. It means you can be intoxicated, just not...
At prayer time, don't get drunk before you go to the mosque. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, all of that kind of analysis is sort of like catching up, or they're playing catch up. But a whole demographic emerged in Muslim societies, and now I'll just turn to Afghan society. You know, in Afghan society, there emerged an elite who were oriented towards this thing I called secular developmentalism in Destiny. They wanted to find a way that they could be Muslims and still have industry, basically, and still have, you know, all of the things, roads and power plants and so on. So in Afghanistan, the problem that exists for every ruler is that they have to present themselves to the inner Afghanistan, to the rural and countryside Afghanistan, where the idea of Islam is so intertwined with the traditions and cultural ways of tribal life and clan life that has developed in Afghanistan over thousands of years. It's so interwoven with that's going to be a conservative and inward-looking bloc. And anybody who wants to rule Afghanistan, once these Western empires were coming, would have to represent themselves as the guarantor and the protector and the hero of Afghan Islam to the inner world, but as the modern-looking, suit-wearing guys who spoke a foreign language to the imperial powers. Every single Afghan ruler from then on had to have that dual face, that Janus face. Periodically in Afghan history, this is why the subtitle of Games Without Rules is The Often Interrupted History of Afghanistan. Within Afghanistan, whoever's in charge is always trying to find a way to consolidate the country so it can be one country under the rule of one state, a national centralized state. So it has been sort of making progress, but it makes a little progress and then something happens to interrupt it. And it's always one or another of these outside powers who decides to get inside Afghanistan and fix it.
Without understanding this dual face thing that they need to do.
Right. And they have regularly decided to do this by putting in their guy in the seat of power and then trusting that he will rule it in the way that they want him to rule it. This has not worked one single time. It's really remarkable how every time they've done the same thing and every time it's failed in the exact same way. You know, in the 1840s or so, the British started and they took out Dost Muhammad, and he was like such a successful builder of nation state. And he was successful at that because he knew how to operate diplomatically with all of the tribal elements in the country. So he was not just a conqueror, he was like he was a slick politician, and he was very good at internal politics. They believed that he was he was too independent. They thought a guy that independent, he's going to bring the Russians in. So they took him out, and they stuck their guy in, who was an incompetent, but, you know, he had, from anything that the British could see...
He was a good bureaucrat or something.
No, not just that. He had just as good legitimacy in dynastic terms as the guy they took out. He was also the grandson or some, you know, close relative of Ahmad Shah Baba. So they thought, well, this is what a ruler of Afghanistan, that's what the ruler has to portray. So they took him out and they put their own guy in. And he was all that legitimacy and stuff, but nobody considered him the ruler of Afghanistan. Why? Because the British had put him in there. He couldn't govern the country. It wasn't that the country united and as one kicked out the British. No, they just said, we're not going to obey this.
Yeah,
this
guy. Random guy who
just
put in.
So the country sort of fragmented, and everybody started fighting the central power, whoever the central power was, and that was the British essentially. So finally they gave up and put the original guy back, and then 30 years later or so, 1870s, they tried it again. They took out one guy and they put in another guy, and same thing happened. They just couldn't do it. And it was always the question of they could rule the cities because they could move their troops in. That was but the countryside is big and open, and who knows where everybody is. They just couldn't govern. So they gave it back to a strong man. The strong man was the strongest strong man that ever lived. He was like a really scary guy, and I'm afraid there's another one of those maybe coming. So his name was Abdurrahman, and he said, I am going to reduce the, rural, tribal Afghanistan to be absolutely under my control. It was a reign of terror, and he just completely put in a whole new set of bureaucrats, state control, all that stuff. Every single person in the country had to have a certificate of identity card. I have one still. I'm here. There's still an identity card for me in a
lockbox or something.
In a box in a building in Kabul with my father's thumbprint on it.
Yeah, God.
And so nobody could travel without permission. There were spies everywhere. So many people were killed. The executions were horrifying. But he got it, he got the country down to where he ruled it. And then, then they could rule. And what happened? They began to look out, say, okay, now we have to try to make nice with the people out there. Within about 3 kings, you got this guy Aman Allah. And he actually went and traveled in Europe, and he said, hey, this is good. Let's make Afghanistan more like this. He came back, and he did all the things that a social progressive would want. And that people of my social class and my group in Kabul, this is what we want. He banned child marriage. He banned the dowry system, which always turns into some kind of bride selling kind of a thing.
This is like 1930s through 70s kind of a thing?
This was the 1920s.
1920s, okay, right, around 1920s.
It was 1920s, and he abolished the veil, the chaudhary, the body bag thing they call a burqa. He just said, no more, that's absolutely done with that. The country revolted. It opened the opportunity for the rural conservatives and other, British or whatever other outside forces came in to help them out. And they overthrew that king. And there was a 9-month reign of exactly like the Taliban. Just exactly what the Taliban are. And then the royal family came back. They reclaimed the throne. And the guy who reclaimed it, his first move was to make sure everybody knew he was as powerfully conservative a Muslim as anybody had ever seen. There was, under him, a ministry of vice and virtue. And they walked around in the streets, their agents, and if you were a woman out there without a veil, you grabbed and put back in your house. Your men folk would come and get your woman, don't let her out here. And if you were eating outdoors in the month of fast, you got a beating. So he was a tough guy, and he was, to all appearance, he was just as conservative as could be. But in fact, once he established that rule, he was soon assassinated. Once his son, once the family had established that rule, they began doing what Afghan rulers have done as soon as they really secure their power. They started trying to modernize and move towards social progress. And by the time my mother came to the country, which was in 1945, they just started the first girls' school. She was a teacher in that school. And within another 10 years, there was girls' schools all over the country. And by 1959, the first experiment in coeducation happened in Afghanistan. One girl went to a school that had probably 200 boys in it.
Yeah.
And that one girl was my sister.
Wow.
And she was, you know, she didn't, the veil had been not outlawed, but the mandate for a veil had been abolished. Nobody had to wear a veil. Wow. And so she wore a black dress, stockings, the sleeves came down to her wrists, but bare hands, bare face, and she wore a chadar. And that was like as far as they were going to go at that moment. But that's how far they went, you know, like baby steps. The king said, we have to walk. If we walk, we'll always move, and we'll move forward. If we run, we'll fall and break our legs, and we won't go anywhere. So that happened, and then in 1978, the Communist Party overthrew the royal dynasty, and it was a very small group. It was probably, I don't know how many communists there really were, but not that many, and they were purely urban, and they immediately began the most extreme program of social progressive laws enforced by military that anybody could imagine. They went to villages and they grabbed, you know, I have this account from a woman who, you know, she was an Afghan woman. She was in Kabul. Later, she came here, and you know, so she saw this with her own eyes. They would send the troops in to a village and say, "Bring out your women. We're going to take them off and educate them." Okay. For the guys in those villages, it's like the government comes with soldiers. Give us your women. That's
not a good look.
That's not a good look. Yeah. So pretty soon, you know, within no time at all, there is rebellion everywhere. Not to mention, there already was, to match the communists, there were Islamists. That was the 60s in Afghanistan. The radicals were not, the student radicals were not all lefties.
Yeah.
The student radicals were just as much righties. And so the Islamists were there. So the country blew up, and they had no choice but to bring in the Soviets. And the Soviets had sort of no choice but to come in, or their little proxy government would be gone. So now these guys their backs were against the wall, and the Soviets decided, they did the same thing. Held the cities, countryside was rebelling. They eviscerated the countryside. They bombed it. They strafed the herds.
Wow.
They did what they could to empty the villages, because that's where the guerrillas were finding their safe refuge. You couldn't tell a guerrilla from a villager because they looked remarkably similar.
Yeah.
And what happened was 6 million refugees in Pakistan, another 6 or so in Iran. And the thing is, though, and you know, this is not often really remarked upon, but the thing is, those refugees in those places were not families. They were the women and children of families. The men of those families were still in the country fighting. So what you got was this 10-year period where the Afghan men were living in a world that was all men, and whose only business was war. And the women and children were living in these squalid refugee camps where they, because of lots of reasons, but culture being among them, they couldn't show their faces outside these tiny little, you know, places, warrens that they could live in. 10 years, that's where the kids grew up and they became the Taliban. And, you know, a friend of mine who was delivering UN aid and stuff, and he was a photographer, he came back, I saw all these pictures of children. You know, they just look like kids. He said, "Man, if you know these guys, these are damaged kids. These guys are going to be trouble."
Yeah, and before diving into the exact the last month or whatever with Afghanistan, I think I want to reflect on a little bit of what you said there. This beautiful thing of in the games without rules. For me, I just love that as a phrase, which is like the in the more rural places, in the countryside, in the mountains or whatever, it's like this classic collectivist kind of bottom up, you just know the people who are around you, and that's the game without rules, where it's like everybody kind of knows this social structure. But when you come in as a Westerner on the outside, what's happening here? We need to go to the ministry or whatever. It's like, whoa, we don't do things that way. It's like you talk to people, you find out what's going on, you shoot the shit, whatever, and then eventually stuff gets done or whatever. And so that huge difference, I just want to highlight, and I just love games without rules. The other thing that I think your book showed me is that just thinking of, I love the off-interrupted history of Afghanistan, where it's like, hey, it's this middle ground place, and it's had a bunch of different rulers in it, or a bunch of different barbarian-ish types, or whatever. There's the Muslim folks initially with caliphates, and then there was the Mongols later, and then there were the Turks to some extent. I'm not sure how much I know about that one, and then there was the Great Game between the British and the Russians, which is just so rough for Afghanistan. You're kind of in. It's just part of colonialism is sad in many ways. That one is just oh man, you're just in between these two countries. And then there's the one in the after World War II with the Cold War, where it's you have U.S. and Soviets who are again doing this a pseudo new kind of great game.
That's
there.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
and so it feels and as you say there, it's there's this beautiful version of Afghanistan, which is, the guy in the 20s and 30s kind of pushing stuff up, and then your sister going to school for the first time. It's yeah, you got to walk before you can run. You got to do evolution, not revolution. But then what either the West sees or what, the Russians saw is just oh no, these women need to be wearing, tank tops and short shorts now. It's wait a second, let's work with the people there to kind of do this in a more, because when you go too fast, you get these, and the traumatic experiences that the men there had, and the women and the children in these refugee camps, that just creates these, trauma-laden kids who then go on to be rough in society. So that all makes sense to me. And then tell me, if we think about, the U.S. involvement in the last, because some of the listeners might be specifically interested in that. It's okay, what we saw from the Western media was oh man, the U.S. has been there for 20 years now, we're out skis, mission accomplished, but we got to kind of run. And now the Taliban are back. Did we make any progress? How do you kind of see the U.S. getting out as a similar part of this pattern that's existed, or how do you kind of understand the last 2 months in Afghanistan, or last kind of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I would say I wrote. I'm going to go back a little bit here, but I'm getting.
I'm good. I like the historical perspective.
Right. So I'm going to go back to 2012 when I was writing Games Without Rules. I was hurrying to get it out because the presidential election was coming up. Mm-hmm. I'm a Vietnam era guy, and I know that, America's at war, that's going to be a huge hot issue in the election. Actually, it was never mentioned even once by either candidate in that election. It's unbelievable. And right before that, somebody asked me at a party, said, what are you working on these days? I said, well, I'm writing a history of Afghanistan that showed. I got that far and I realized they'd stopped listening. They heard the word Afghanistan. I was like, oh, God, boring. I don't want to do that. This was not the forever war. This was the unobserved. It was aggressively unnoticed. It was the aggressively forgotten war. It's unbelievable to me that people in these 20 years are not aware that there was a war going on, and it was a savage war. It was a war in which people were dying in horrible ways, but not in the cities. I went back 10 years after 9/11, and Kabul, you could walk around anywhere. The sense of tension was everywhere. Whoa. But you were not, nothing happened to me. I walked around.
You're here now.
Yeah, I'm here now. Yeah. So you could already see that something was going wrong, I'd say, in 2012. And I think the policy people knew that, because the argument was continually, should we put in more troops? Mm-hmm. And the word Taliban was often used And I thought it was misused because the word suggests a particular group. So that the syndrome was to read in the news, they got the number 12 guy. Now they got the number 3 guy. Now they got the number 34 guy. As if that's what it was. You know, as if there was some structure there, and that if you could get rid of that spider, that organism, then everything would be fine. But actually the problem was Talibanism. And Talibanism was some kind of melange of, you know, the idea of Islam plus the idea of the old Afghanistan, you know, the old tribal Afghanistan, plus, you know, just all of that stuff. And to the extent that the violence and the bloodshed was not stopping throughout the country. In 2012, when I went, you could not drive from a major city to another major city. You were to fly. Actually, I did drive, or we did, a bunch of us, from Kabul to Bamyan in central Afghanistan. But the plans were laid, and we were told, you know, just be ready. And on a certain midnight, the call came that tomorrow at 6 we're leaving.
Go.
Because they didn't want the word to get out so that nobody along the way would set up an ambush. And then we got to Bamyan and it was fine. Once we got there, that was fine. We were there. So Afghanistan was like that. The cities, and then there was the country. And it's like, this war is not going where it should. Right around then was also when it ramped up into drone warfare. And the drone warfare, I think, enabled the American public to even more just not notice it. Because in fact, the casualties on the American side, considering the savagery of the war, the American casualties were very small. And so people could afford not to notice it. And then too, unlike the Vietnam era, when there was a draft, people like me were like, oh, we hate this war, we might be there. Now, it's supposedly, you know, it's like a professional army, but what it means is the volunteers that sign up are people who are, they have economic difficulties, and this is a way out.
The lower class folks
it's a lower class thing. Yeah. So what you have, a lot of like rural poor folks from America get into the army. They go to Afghanistan, so it's poor country boys from America fighting poor country boys from Afghanistan, and elites on both sides just unaware, unnoticing, not at all. It just isn't happening. And then, you know, the way the war was launched, it was necessary to rally public support for war, and that's, you always need to have a noble purpose. You know, you can't. It's politically difficult to, especially in a democracy, to have a war in which your stated purpose is, you know, to increase gun sales and, you know, put a base in some place where you can get some minerals, whatever. That's not the way you can sell a war. So here, because of the Taliban and their depredations, it was a ready sell. You know, it's like, we're going to save the women of Afghanistan. And so it was a noble war. And so the left was on board. And then the right was like, these are the Muslims, the Sharia. You want Sharia? You want your daughters to be... so then from the right, it was like the noble war. We're fighting the infidels. So all of that nobility, you know, all of that self-congratulatory...
Greater than thou,
that accrued to the war. It became the good war. And so that was all the more reason why nobody paid attention. And when so now we're talking about August and September, we're this year. What I keep hearing is they left so suddenly. It's like, wait, the withdrawal was originally set for 2014. How sudden is that? How could nobody... You know, we weren't ready. How could you not be ready? This is 8 years later. Yeah, but it was all the troops were yanked out. There were only 2,500 troops. That's not like they'd been withdrawing all the time.
Yeah.
When the Taliban took the cities suddenly within a month, they took them basically without a fight. There was fighting in Herat and some in Kunduz, but basically they walked into those cities. And everybody was waiting for that, I think, out there in the cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And especially, you know, where the war had been hot in the Helmand Valley and Lashkar and Kandahar and places like that. Mm-hmm. Ordinary people were like, we don't care who wins. Can we just please stop? And so the Taliban had a program they were running on
Mm-hmm.
that was very popular. If we win, the war stops. It's not clear that that's true,
Mm-hmm.
but that certainly, I'm sure, felt true to people.
Yeah.
And, you know, one last thing I want to say, go back now to drones and to the war. Back then in 2012 to 2010, 11, in that period, there was some discussion about how the American soldiers should be armed, you know, how they should be clad when they went into battle in Afghanistan. And it was, understandably thought that every piece of body armor they could have, they should have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course you want that, you know, you want your soldiers to survive. But when you looked at a soldier, you saw a guy from an alien from outer space.
Yeah.
They didn't look like the humans that people in the villages. So quite apart from anything about democracy these guys were saying, or Islam, these guys, but apart from ideology, it's like, these guys are humans, and what are these guys? I don't know what they are. Both sides are lobbing bombs. People, when the fight is over, your relatives are dead.
Yeah.
You're going to feel like the war is those guys coming to our place, because they're from someplace else and you're at home.
Yeah.
And the drones only exacerbates that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the drones are like...
Yeah, it's like that's even more alien of a thing.
Yeah, they're just the bombs.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. I think that there's I definitely agree. I mean, the drones and then this whole macro narrative of like, yeah, what controls the news cycle and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, that you know, Afghanistan, after the very, very beginning, essentially, everybody was like, I don't really want to talk about that kind of thing. And especially, I think I like the phrasing of, you know, the poor rural boys from both places essentially were fighting each other while the elites were just doing their own thing. Yeah. That seems directionally correct. One thing that I didn't quite understand, both from the book Destiny Disrupted and from like modern day Afghanistan, is, you know, you talk about like the Taliban, and for me, something that's been a learning over the last, you know, a little bit of time as I've like read more about the Middle East and Islam. Is like, okay, you had is like how kind of this kind of Islamic, what I would traditionally call Islamic extremism, or what I might now call Salafism or Wahhabism or whatever. And so it's like you have this or kind of a response to Western decadence. You know, you have the Western decadence happening, you have modernity happening, modernity quote unquote, and then you have this kind of pushback from Wahhab, and then Wahhab plus the Saudis creating this new state, and then kind of like petro-Islam or whatever, kind of pushing Wahhabism out into the world, and then Salafism is maybe like the nice term of Wahhabism, and it's like these versions of, and I think that they do a really, as far as I can tell, like Wahhabism does a really good job of saying, hey, there's Dar al-Islam, the land of peace or whatever, and then Dar al-Harb, maybe something like the land without Islam, without peace, and like creating those two worlds and then saying we want to create the world of peace. And so that feels like a powerful meme to spread and something, but like, why is it the case that kind of Wahhabism or the Taliban or these kinds of things are so kind of, in my mind, like powerful as these like cultural entities, you know, like, yeah, why are they so powerful?
Well, I think that there's a question of identity here.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll quote myself now again. I just wrote a piece responding to the things that happened. And what I would say is, the Afghanistan that the West, first the Soviets, then the Americans, that they wanted to put in place here was one in which the majority of Afghans, really, rural Afghans, but there's also a lot of urban Afghans, they looked at that society and they didn't see it. They didn't see themselves in there.
Yeah.
They saw a story in which they were not a character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, identity, human identity is the ability to see a character, to see a story that your society is playing out in which you're an important character. You might not be important even, but a meaningful character. You know who you are in that story. And, I think that a lot of the power of the jihadist narrative in the Islamic world comes from the fact that it's tapping a narrative that has already been almost like a childhood nursery rhyme folk tale for Muslim kids. They grow up with that story of the thing that happened in Medina long ago, where the guy went into a cave and an angel said, "You are going to speak for God from now on, and your world is full of warfare, but we're going to tell you how people should live, and this war is going to end." Mm-hmm. This is the mythos of the Islamic story. And then he went and he gathered his followers, and Medina said, yes, please come, teach us how to live. And he issued the laws, and people, the biggest empires on earth, the Byzantines, the Persians, the superpowers of the time, they tried to crush this little group, and they failed because God was on the side of this little community whose only real power was they were doing it right. Mm-hmm. So that's like a bedtime story.
Yeah.
For kids. So when you grow up, the structure of that narrative is there. Now somebody comes and says, "Hey, the world is divided into Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Mm-hmm. And yes, Islam looks like it's been beaten down and there's only a few of us left. But some of us have rediscovered the golden apple and whatever. And we're going to start to do that again. We're going to live just the way they did in Medina, and then it'll happen. So there's like a supernatural belief there, a magical belief.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that's a great, you want a narrative that you want to believe in, and that narrative that you've been told kind of fits well with the narrative the childhood narrative kind of fits well with these kind of the like jihadist narratives or whatever. And I think it makes me think a little bit about, and I think this might be a little bit of like me being like too mean or something to like the jihadists or something like that, but like it reminds me a bit of like some folks have talked about the Trump kind of January 6th riot and stuff like that. It's like an example in like LARPing. Have you heard that term before?
No.
It means live action role playing. And it's when you're people will do it when they go out into the park and they put on their like medieval costumes and they'll fight each other. And it's like they're playing pretend that they're in this old world. And there's something about like, at the Capitol when you had the guy with the furs.
The shaman.
Yeah, the shaman guy. Like he was LARPing. He was there. He was like doing a thing that technically, from their little weird perspective, it was like, oh, they're taking back. It was a steal. All these things. And they memed this like weird reality into existence, and like similarly, that sounds kind of similar to this. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
that's what it is. It's like the role of narrative is something that we really have to think about this. You were talking about information wants certain things, and when you say it that way, you're representing information as having willpower. And I have a version of that myself in which I would like to say that narrative is exactly analogous to a biological organism, and it has a will to survive, and it has a will to prosper. And so then the question, that this is the main thing I think about these days, actually. And the question comes up, how could that be? Since in fact, a narrative doesn't exist without the people who are telling the story. But I think that individuals, I think that actually narrative is how we are able to see the world at all. I think here we can actually ask the scientists if they agree, the neuroscientists, and they'll say, yeah, we agree. Because our perception is not like a video screen that just is reality. We have senses that go out, sample, this little bit, and they feed it into a model we've built inside of our heads. And then our responses are based on how that fits in the model. And if the response brings us good things, then okay, the model must be right. And if it leads to some harm, the model needs to be corrected. But the model is always what we're living inside of.
Yeah.
And the model is a narrative. The narrative is an unfolding story. So I think that in normal times, when things are more or less the same every day, the narrative works. It helps us. It helps us classify new information coming to us as relevant or irrelevant, and or true or false, and or good for me or harmful to me. And as long as things are more or less regular, then that's a good thing. That's how we can function, because we can't actually ask for evidence for every piece of information that comes in. We actually have to take things. Most things, our quick judgment of them have to be, does it fit with everything else I know? And if it does, then okay, you can come in, you can be part of my... that's how narratives keep themselves going, because groups of people have narratives they share, and groups of people, by virtue of their shared narrative, have a group self, have a social self. The social self, when things are in disarray, that social self is under threat of extinction, because the narratives are not working. Everybody says this is what's happening, and they can't agree. So people cluster to the smallest, the largest group that can totally agree, which becomes smaller and smaller.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it reminds me of, I think you wrote in Destiny Disrupted, which is like that of one of the super powerful things about the new kind of nation states around the 1500s Western Europe time was this shared language, and that you were like a knife, like everybody was aligned in one direction. You would cut like a knife through bread, and the bread was the kind of barbarians or whoever else, the empires that had all these like random people out there. So that's, again, I think I really like what you said about narratives as these organisms, and I think they want to self-perpetuate, and we'll see how they do that. So thank you for your time today, Tamim. I think that there's, so many juicy things for our listeners to dive into here. I think that as a reminder for our listeners, I've only read Destiny Disrupted, but I've watched some talks about games without rules, and I have the history of what's your latest book called?
The Invention of Yesterday.
The Invention of Yesterday, which is a big history of 50,000 years. Again, I really think this Destiny Disrupted is. Goodreads, it has like 4.4 stars. Like nothing gets 4.4 stars. So I was like, okay, I got to read this. And all the one of the great reviews for it at the bottom said, this is a person who has a master's in Middle Eastern studies, and this is the book that they give. This is both the most helpful book for them, and it's the one that they give to all beginners. So it's like, definitely check that out. Or the other Games Without Rules if you want to look at Afghanistan, or the 50,000 years, the Invention of Yesterday if you want to understand big history stuff. Tamim, is there anything else that you want to kind of leave our listeners with, either advice or books to check out, or where to find you on the interwebs or any of that stuff?
Well, I'll just say that people often label my book the History of Yesterday. That's a trivial sort of a title. No, it's the Invention of Yesterday. And if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't make the subtitle what it was. I'd subtitle it The Human Story from the Stone Age to the Virtual Age. Because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at history and say, is there some single story you can tell that is the human story? That's what I try to do there. And
love it.
thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you again. And I'm just fingers crossed for Afghanistan in the long term to have this beautiful relationship between the rural parts and the urban parts, and for there to be less also like a little bit of like outsider like development is okay, but like to in general allow the people there to kind of self-determine things to some extent. Is that right?
If they could have sovereignty and peace, they would then pursue social progress. I really, really believe that.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you again, Tamim, and thank you, listeners, for coming on today. Goodbye, everybody.